there is one feature of the Christian faith which makes it radically different from every other religion.
Really? That's interesting. I'm all ears.
The resurrection.
Well, knock me over with a feather. The resurrection, you say? I guess Osiris, Horus, Buddha, Mithra, Krishna, and all the other divine beings who allegedly came back from the dead just didn't get the memo. Clearly, Christianity has a monopoly on resurrection stories. It even has several of them, in fact. We've got Zarephath and Lazarus to just scratch the surface. As good old Christopher Hitchens put it,
the Gospels tell us that at the time of the crucifixion, all the graves in Jerusalem opened and their occupants wandered around the streets to greet. So that it seems the resurrection was something of a banality at the time. Not all of those people clearly were divinely conceived.
That said, it's fair to say that the resurrection of Jesus plays a unique role in the Christian faith. And considering just how many people are convinced of this supposed miraculous event, I think it merits attention. According to the channel Lines of Evidence, the resurrection of Jesus is a historical fact and proof that God exists, and we use their video to delve into some of the most common arguments that Christians put forth, with us this time focusing on what can be called the argument from eyewitness testimony.
Did Jesus Christ really come back from the dead? Yes, he did. In fact, is the only logical conclusion to be drawn from the evidence.
Claiming that there is only one logical conclusion to be drawn, and that this conclusion is that a miracle happened, is a feature of religious dogma. But unfortunately, this isn't a rare position for Christians to take. As we get into later, they pretty much need the resurrection to be undeniable for their broader theological claims to be even palatable.
To begin with, it was heavily documented through eyewitness testimony.
Well, if we're swimming in a sea of documentation, uncovering these first-hand narratives should be as straightforward as a stroll through the archives. It should be as easy to demonstrate as the confidence of the author suggests. So, enlighten us. How many of these eyewitness accounts do we have?
The four Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John record Jesus' interactions with numerous people following his resurrection.
4 accounts, huh? Wow, you're really building a strong case here. Though, I wouldn't bring it before a court, as personal testimony is considered one of the least reliable forms of evidence, prone to distortion and bias. I mean, who needs more than a handful of stories about an event that defies everything we know about reality? It's not like extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, huh? But hey, I'm sure these 4 accounts are completely independent, unbiased, and totally reliable. It's not like they could have been influenced by each other or anything, right?
Sometimes foreshadowing is relatively obvious.
Now, of these accounts, scholarly consensus, including from Christian scholars, tell us that these texts were written decades after the events they describe, by followers who believe deeply in Jesus' divinity. This context doesn't automatically discredit their accounts, of course, but it does invite us to question how memory, belief, and community might shape storytelling. It encourages, at the very least, a healthy dose of skepticism.
Paul adds that Jesus made an appearance to over 500 people at one time.
Oh, Paul? You mean the guy that didn't meet Jesus, and didn't meet an apostle until years after the alleged event? That Paul? Well, if he says it happened, it must be true. I mean, sure, it's not 500 eyewitnesses, but rather just one guy claiming that there are 500 witnesses. But who needs corroboration when you've got Paul's word? It's not like he had a reason to embellish or anything. I'm sure he was totally objective and unbiased. But hey, maybe I'm being too harsh. After all, if 500 people saw it, there must be a ton of written accounts from them, right? Right?
Paul wrote to the Corinthians that most of those eyewitnesses were still alive at the time of his writing.
No way! Most of those supposed 500 eyewitnesses were still kicking around 20 to 25 years later when Paul wrote about it. That's a miracle in its own right. Seriously, what are the odds that out of 500 people, not a single one of them could write or knew someone literate who could document this allegedly life-changing event over the course of 2 decades? Not one account. The only thing we have here is Paul, who wasn't there, simply claiming secondhand that they saw the resurrected Jesus. This is what we call hearsay.
Hearsay?
It's almost as if, and bear with me here, this claim is less reliable than the countless alien abductions we hear about. But no, that can't be right. Paul said it, so it must be true. That's the rule here, no? Never mind that he wasn't even there and had every reason to promote this new religion. Just ignore that. You know, I'm starting to think that the creator of this video might be onto something here. Who needs first-hand accounts and contemporary evidence when you've got second-hand stories from biased sources? That's how history works, right? I can't wait to see what other incredible stories they've got in store for us. Bring on the talking donkeys and the parting of the seas.
The implication is clear. If you doubt the resurrection, there are a host of people you can go ask who saw him with their own 2 eyes.
Hold up, let me get this straight. You're telling me that if I doubt the resurrection, I can just ask a bunch of people who saw it with their own eyes? Now, that is incredible. I mean, it's not like those people have been dead for nearly 2,000 years or anything. Are they gonna resurrect for story time or something? But hey, let's ignore the glaring problem with this argument for a moment. If we could actually interrogate these supposed eyewitnesses, I'm sure their accounts would be rock solid and completely consistent, right? But we can't, because they don't exist. Despite the confidence of Christians as we're seeing here, this crucial, miraculous claim is unsupported. When it comes to the resurrection, an extraordinarily miraculous claim, we have extraordinarily poor evidence. What we have is a handful of contradictory, second-hand accounts written decades after the supposed event by anonymous authors with a clear agenda to promote an early Christian movement. We don't have any contemporary historical records, physical evidence, or neutral eyewitness testimony that would be expected for such a monumental occurrence. Not a single record. The earliest gospel, Mark, doesn't even include any post-resurrection appearances by Jesus. None. Let that sink in. And the other Gospels that do mention appearances present conflicting details about who saw Jesus, where and when. They read precisely like legendary embellishments rather than sober historical reporting. What's more, outside of the Bible, the evidence is even more lacking. There are no reliable extra-biblical references to a resurrected Jesus at all. Period. The earliest non-Christian source that even mentions Jesus is a brief passage in the writings of Josephus, a Jewish historian who wrote about 93 to 94 CE. However, there is no mention of the resurrection, except for in later translations of his work, which scholars, including Christian scholars, agree that it was likely an addition by Christian scribes. Look, if Jesus really had resurrected and had appeared to hundreds of witnesses, as Paul claims, we would expect, would we not, to find at least some mention of this extraordinary event in the writings of contemporary historians and officials. But there is a glaring absence of any such corroborating evidence. Making things worse for the faithful, Romans were meticulous record keepers, and a resurrected Jewish preacher who attracted a large following would have surely merited some comment. Yet no such records have been found. The lack of any credible extra-biblical evidence for the resurrection is extremely telling. It stretches credulity to believe that the most amazing miracle in history, witnessed by hundreds, would go completely unmentioned by all contemporary writers and leave no trace in the historical record outside of late, biased, second-hand accounts written by early Christians with a vested interest in promoting belief in Jesus' divinity. This glaring absence of corroborative evidence outside the Bible is a major red flag that casts serious doubt on the resurrection story. If the gospel accounts were reliable history, we would expect to find at least some mention in other contemporary sources. The fact that we don't is most easily explained by recognizing the resurrection as a later legendary development, not an actual historical occurrence. Alright, I've said quite a bit here, and now I want to pivot. What gives? I'm serious. What gives? Why are so many seemingly rational Christians so outrageously gullible when it comes to the resurrection? I mean, they don't apply the same standard to other miracle claims, do they? We don't see them rushing to believe that Muhammad split the moon just because the Quran says that people saw it happen, do we? They are not this gullible when it comes to claims outside of their faith, and so they have no right to demand such gullibility on our behalf. By applying their reasoning to other religions, the folly of their pursuit becomes apparent. And this brings me to a point that I've been mulling over for quite some time. When I was younger, I often found myself puzzled by the seemingly weak arguments many Christians present in defense of the resurrection. As I've grown, I've considered various reasons for this, but the most convincing explanation I've come across has little to do with the resurrection of Jesus itself. Instead, it's deeply tied to the overarching Christian narrative. You see, Christians are anchored by the belief that dire consequences await those who do not affirm the resurrection and accept Jesus as their saviour. This belief isn't just a minor detail, it's a cornerstone of the faith that torment or annihilation awaits non-believers. Therefore, the story of the resurrection needs to be overwhelmingly compelling, leaving no room for doubt, because this is how they justify a supposed loving God inflicting such horrendous punishment on those who don't believe. This necessity transforms the narrative into something that must be defended at all costs, not because the arguments are sound, but because the perceived consequences of disbelief are too grave. And this is especially the case for those whose faith was thrust upon them as children. We tend to simply accept the world as our parents, as our community presents it, which explains why adherents of other faiths exercise similar gullibility towards their own miracles. The telltale sign is that this fervent defense and the suppression of critical faculties is never applied by adherents to the claims of other religions. This selective skepticism, or perhaps more accurately, selective gullibility, is incredibly telling. It reveals a fundamental inconsistency in the way that believers approach their faith versus how they view other faiths. When actions and beliefs seem inconsistent and unmotivated, it's a clear sign to dig deeper, to look beyond the surface and understand the underlying motivations. For me, this inconsistency is a glaring red flag. It suggests that the foundation of belief is not as solid or as rational as it's often portrayed. Instead, it's built upon a deeply emotional and psychological investment in the narrative, driven by fear of the consequences of disbelief and a profound desire for the story to be true.